Right, we're going to be replacing the upper control arm on this 2004 Nissan Frontier. Let's start by jacking the truck up and removing the wheel. Now with the wheel removed, we're going to locate the bolts that are holding the upper control arm in place here. And we got a cotter pin, and all those bolts are going to be 22 millimeters. So let's start by breaking those loose. Before taking any of the upper bolts off of the control arm, I'm going to go through and mark the spot using some tire paint that I picked up from AutoZone. And the goal here is to try to just make sure that whenever I put everything back together, it's going to be aligned as best as possible. You're going to want to take it to the alignment shop after you're done doing these upper control arms. But there's a little notch right here, and I'm just going to mark it on the notch and then on the rail here. You'll see what I mean in just a second. Now I went ahead and just put like a dot. You could probably use a white crayon to do the same thing. But I did it on both the outer and the inner. Okay, so now that we've marked everything, we're going to go ahead and begin by removing the cotter pin that's underneath the nut for the ball joint. Right, with that cotter pin removed, we're going to go through and start loosening up this bolt on the underneath the ball joint. Again, it's a 22 millimeter. Now that the bolt is loose, you can see that it's already starting to separate from the knuckle in this ball joint. I'm going to leave it on a couple threads, and then I'm going to work on breaking loose the two bolts on the upper part. Now I've already broken the bolts loose, but I'm gonna use a breaker bar to get the job done. Again, 22 millimeter on the nut of that bolt. On the left side, we're going up. And on the right side, we are going down. At this point, with the bolts broken loose, what you notice is the upper control arm is kind of angled towards the ground. We're gonna wanna give it a little bit of support and get some pressure off of those bolts as we try to knock them free. So I'm gonna place the jack underneath the lower control arm and try to jack up the truck just a little bit, just to relieve some of that pressure. Wanna make sure that I'm not jacking it up off of the jack stand. So just be mindful. We just kind of wanna level out the truck suspension. All right, now that we have supported the suspension, even things out just a little bit, take some pressure off those bolts that are going through, I'm gonna work on getting that ball joint out, and then I'll start to remove the upper bolts and that long bolt going through. All right, with the nut completely off of the ball joint should just slip right off. Let's see if this works. I'm gonna kind of just wiggle it just ever so slightly. Actually, I'm gonna need to put my camera down, but it should be fairly easy. You're just gonna move it back and forth and see if there's any give, and then it should slowly lift out. All right, as I mentioned, that was pretty easy. One thing to note is there is this wire that we did disconnect from here. You will end up eventually taking this off using a 10 millimeter socket. There's a little bolt under there. And also up here, you're gonna wanna remove just the wire, not the whole thing holding it together. But we'll go ahead and start working on those bolts in the back, and hopefully this runs pretty smooth. Now that went incredibly smooth. I will note that a couple days prior to this, I hosed everything down that I was going to be loosening with this PB blaster, and I just went crazy spraying it, and I just kind of let it set in, and it seemed to work out pretty good. All the bolts came off really easy. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this upper control arm, and we'll get working on the new one. All right, out with the old, in with the new. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we're gonna need to remove this bracket right here. That's a 10mm bolt. And so we're gonna go ahead and switch it over to the new one. Now it's pretty easy, straightforward. You have a threaded hole there, and you have a little notch that'll make sure that everything gets lined up according to how it's supposed to go. Always double check your parts, make sure that they are the correct size before going through and putting them on. These ones look correct, so I'm gonna go ahead and switch this over and work on putting in the upper control arm. Okay, now that that's switched over, I'll kind of give you an idea of what the next step is, but first let's take a look at this bolt that we took off that goes on the upper part. Now I separate it by size, so as I take off this side, I kind of set the parts over here. Take off that side, set the parts over here. But here's what's going on up there. So like I mentioned before, you have these little notches here. Mine has white paint, and I also have white paint on that rail, just so I'm trying to align those white paints the best I can. But on the bolt itself, you can see that there is a little groove here. Now on the back of that washer, there's a little notch that lines perfectly in there. So you want to make sure that when you go through and put it on, that those all line up accordingly. Now, when installing this control arm, setting it in place, I'm not going to try to line it right off the bat. I'm just going to try to get the bolt through the hole and get the upper control arm just in there. Once I start torquing everything down, that's when I'll really start to align it. All right, I didn't film any of that because we all know that the way I do it is probably not how it would work out for you, and everything kind of went according to plan as best as it could. It didn't take me very long to get those aligned. So as I mentioned earlier, just get those bolts in. I'm gonna work on just kind of threading the the nut on that bolt ever so slightly, just kind of hold things in place, and then I'll work on putting this ball joint back together. Okay, I got everything hand tightened in. Even went through and put on the nut for the ball joint. I'm gonna go ahead and torque everything down. I believe in the back it's 90 something. I'm not quite sure on the torque specs. You might want to look that up on your own. And on this nut, I think it's like 49, something like that. Again, you want to do your own due diligence and look it up yourself. Don't take my word. So now that we're ready to torque everything down, I'm going to use a wrench to hold things in place. You can see that my white paint right there is aligned. I'll use a wrench on this side, on the inner, and then I'm going to use my ratchet on the outer and make sure that those white dots are pretty close to each other as I start going through and tighten these bolts. All right, according to what I found online, I saw that these right here have to be torqued down to 94 foot-pounds, and that is going to be 58. Looks like everything is completely torqued down. Last thing that I'm going to do is put this back on its rails that it came off of, and put the cotter pin in and call it a day. Put the wheel back on. Here's a look at everything that I used to complete this job. If you found this video helpful, go ahead and hit that like button. I'm not a mechanic, I'm just a do-it-yourself kind of person. Did this in my own garage. This is actually my first time doing an upper control arm. So, I mean, maybe I made some mistakes along the way, but overall, I feel like it looks pretty good. It's a pretty straightforward job. Just get out and do it.